Majjhima Nikaya, the middle-length discourse. 26 Pāsarāsi Sutta. The Noble Search. Part 1. 5. 1. Thus have I heard. On one occasion the Blessed One was living at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. 2. Then, when it was morning, the Blessed One dressed, and taking his bowl and outer robe, went into Savatthi for alms. Then a number of bhikkhus went to the Venerable Ananda and said to him, "Friend Ananda, it is long since we heard a talk on the Dhamma from the Blessed One's own lips. It would be good if we could get to hear such a talk, friend Ananda. Then let the Venerable Ones go to the Brahmin Ramaka's hermitage. Perhaps you will get to hear a talk on the Dhamma from the Blessed One's own lips." "Yes, friend," they replied. 3. Then, when the Blessed One had wandered for alms in Savatthi and had returned from his alms round, after his meal he addressed the Venerable Ananda. "Ananda, let us go to the eastern park, to the palace of Megara's mother, for the day's abiding." "Yes, Venerable Sir," the Venerable Ananda replied. Then the Blessed One went with the Venerable Ananda to the eastern park, the palace of Megara's mother, for the day's abiding. Then, when it was evening, the Blessed One rose from meditation and addressed the Venerable Ananda. "Ananda, let us go to the eastern bathing place to bathe." "Yes, Venerable Sir," the Venerable Ananda replied. Then the Blessed One went with the Venerable Ananda to the eastern bathing place to bathe. When he was finished, he came up out of the water and stood in one robe drying his limbs. Then the Venerable Ananda said to the Blessed One, "Venerable Sir, the Brahmin Ramaka's hermitage is nearby. That hermitage is agreeable and delightful. Venerable Sir, it would be good if the Blessed One went there out of compassion." The Blessed One consented in silence. 4. Then the Blessed One went to the Brahmin Ramaka's hermitage. Now on that occasion a number of bhikkhus were sitting together in the hermitage discussing the Dhamma. The Blessed One stood outside the door waiting for their discussion to end. When he knew that it was over, he coughed and knocked, and the bhikkhus opened the door for him. The Blessed One entered, sat down on a seat made ready, and addressed the bhikkhus thus, "Bhikkhus, for what discussion are you sitting together here now? And what was your discussion that was interrupted?" "Venerable Sir, our discussion on the Dhamma that was interrupted was about the Blessed One himself." Then the Blessed One arrived. "Good, bhikkhus. It is fitting for you clansmen who have gone forth out of faith from the home life into homelessness to sit together to discuss the Dhamma. When you gather together, bhikkhus, you should do either of two things: hold discussion on the Dhamma or maintain noble silence." 2 kinds of search. 5. Bhikkhus, there are these 2 kinds of search, the noble search and the ignoble search. And what is the ignoble search? Here someone being himself subject to birth seeks what is also subject to birth. Being himself subject to aging, he seeks what is also subject to aging. Being himself subject to sickness, he seeks what is also subject to sickness. Being himself subject to death, he seeks what is also subject to death. Being himself subject to sorrow, he seeks what is also subject to sorrow. Being himself subject to defilement, he seeks what is also subject to defilement. 6. And what may be said to be subject to birth? Wife and children are subject to birth, men and women slaves, goats and sheep, fowl and pigs, elephants, cattle, horses, and mares, gold and silver are subject to birth. These acquisitions are subject to birth, and one who is tied to these things, infatuated with them, and utterly committed to them, being himself subject to birth, seeks what is also subject to birth. 7. And what may be said to be subject to aging? Wife and children are subject to aging, men and women slaves, goats and sheep, fowl and pigs, elephants, cattle, horses, and mares, gold and silver are subject to aging. These acquisitions are subject to aging. and one who is tied to these things, infatuated with them, and utterly committed to them, being himself subject to aging, seeks what is also subject to aging. 8. And what may be said to be subject to sickness. Wife and children are subject to sickness, men and women slaves, goats and sheep, fowl and pigs, elephants, cattle, horses, and mares are subject to sickness. These acquisitions are subject to sickness. And one who is tied to these things, infatuated with them, and utterly committed to them, being himself subject to sickness, seeks what is also subject to sickness. 9. And what may be said to be subject to death? Wife and children are subject to death, men and women slaves, goats and sheep, fowl and pigs, elephants, cattle, horses, and mares are subject to death. These acquisitions are subject to death, and one who is tied to these things, infatuated with them, and utterly committed to them, being himself subject to death, seeks what is also subject to death. 10. And what may be said to be subject to sorrow. Wife and children are subject to sorrow, men and women slaves, goats and sheep, fowl and pigs, elephants, cattle, horses, and mares are subject to sorrow. These acquisitions are subject to sorrow. And one who is tied to these things, infatuated with them, and utterly committed to them, being himself subject to sorrow, seeks what is also subject to sorrow. 11. And what may be said to be subject to defilement. Wife and children are subject to defilement, men and women slaves, goats and sheep, fowl and pigs, elephants, cattle, horses, and mares, gold and silver are subject to defilement. These acquisitions are subject to defilement. And one who is tied to these things, infatuated with them, and utterly committed to them, being himself subject to defilement, seeks what is also subject to defilement. This is the ignoble search. 12. And what is the noble search? Here someone being himself subject to birth, having understood the danger in what is subject to birth, seeks the unborn supreme security from bondage, nibbana. Being himself subject to aging, having understood the danger in what is subject to aging, he seeks the unaging supreme security from bondage, nibbana. Being himself subject to sickness, having understood the danger in what is subject to sickness, he seeks the unailing supreme security from bondage, nibbana. Being himself subject to death, having understood the danger in what is subject to death, he seeks the deathless supreme security from bondage, nibbana. Being himself subject to sorrow, having understood the danger in what is subject to sorrow, he seeks the sorrowless supreme security from bondage, nibbana. Being himself subject to defilement, having understood the danger in what is subject to defilement, he seeks the undefiled supreme security from bondage, nibbana. This is the noble search.